At 3 o'clock in the morning on May the 29th, 1943, a strange weakness opened inside the American lines on Attu Island. The battle was supposed to be almost over. For more than 2 weeks, American soldiers had pushed the Japanese defenders backward across freezing mountains, flooded valleys, and ridges buried in fog. The surviving Japanese force had been compressed into a shrinking pocket near Chichago Harbor. American commanders believed they had reached the final stage. Then, before dawn, roughly 800 Japanese soldiers still capable of fighting came out of that pocket. They did not stay behind their defenses. They attacked. And almost immediately, something happened that the Americans had not expected. The Japanese broke through. They smashed past forward positions, penetrated deep enough to reach American medical and support areas, and began moving toward one of the most dangerous objectives they could possibly capture: the artillery around Engineer Hill. For a brief period, the final Japanese attack on Attu was no longer simply a desperate last stand. It had become a real breakthrough. And the troops who suddenly stood between the attackers and the American guns were not a carefully prepared infantry battalion. They included engineers, medics, headquarters personnel, and service troops who had expected the main fighting to be somewhere else. This is the story of how an 800-man Banzai charge smashed through US lines on American soil, and how a battle that seemed finished suddenly became a fight for survival. To understand why that breakthrough mattered, you first have to understand where it happened. Not Guadalcanal, not New Guinea, not some distant island thousands of miles from American territory. Attu was part of Alaska. In 1943, Alaska was still a US territory rather than a state, but Attu was American soil. It sits near the western end of the Aleutian Chain, an arc of islands stretching roughly 1,000 miles westward from Alaska toward Asia. Attu itself is about 40 miles long and 20 miles wide, surrounded by cold northern seas and covered with volcanic mountains, steep ridges, tundra, snow, and valleys that could disappear inside dense fog. Weather was not simply an inconvenience there. It was part of the battlefield. Rain or snow falls on the region around 200 days a year. Powerful winds can sweep across exposed ground. Temperatures during the spring campaign hovered around freezing. Lower ground could become wet, soft tundra, while the higher ridges remained covered in snow. And yet, this isolated island had suddenly become strategically and psychologically important. In June 1942, while the Battle of Midway was unfolding far to the south, Japanese forces attacked the Aleutians. They bombed Dutch Harbor and occupied Attu and Kiska. For Americans following the war, the meaning was impossible to ignore. Foreign troops were now occupying American territory. The Unangaks people living on Attu were taken away by the Japanese. Many would not survive captivity. And so, almost a year later, the United States came back. The National Park Service describes the May 1943 operation as the first effort since the War of 1812 to expel invaders from American soil. But the Americans were about to discover something else. Recapturing Attu would require fighting two enemies at the same time: the Japanese army and Attu itself. On May 11, 1943, approximately 12,500 American soldiers began landing on Attu. The main force came from the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division. The operation divided the assault between northern and southern landing forces. Troops came ashore around Holtz Bay in the north and Massacre Bay in the south. The Japanese did something that would make the battle far more difficult. They did not try to destroy the invasion on the beaches. Instead, they occupied the high ground. They used ridges, passes, hidden positions, foxholes, machine guns, mortars, and snipers. Fog helped conceal them. The terrain forced American troops into narrow approaches where a relatively small defensive position could slow an entire advance. The Southern force landed and moved inland. Then it stopped. The Northern force pushed forward. It also slowed. The distances on a map looked small. On the ground, they were enormous. American troops climbing the mountains were wet, cold, exhausted, and often moving across terrain that offered very little cover. Supplies were difficult to move. Visibility could vanish without warning. Aircraft could struggle to find troops beneath the fog. Some soldiers went without food. Others developed frostbite and trench foot because their boots and equipment were not suited to prolonged fighting in Attu's cold, wet conditions. The weather eventually removed more American troops from action than enemy fire. More than 2,100 American soldiers were taken out of the fight by disease and non-battle injuries, according to National Park Service figures. That number matters because it explains one of the central problems that would appear 17 days later. By the end of May, the Americans had overwhelming numerical superiority. But overwhelming numbers across an entire island do not mean every ridge, every pass, every aid station, and every artillery position is equally protected. And Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, commanding the Japanese garrison, was about to gamble everything on finding exactly one weak point. The Americans gradually solved the problem Attu presented. Northern and Southern forces finally linked up. Japanese positions were forced backward. Ridge after ridge fell. By late May, the surviving defenders were being compressed toward Chichago Harbor. Their strategic situation was hopeless. Japan could no longer reliably reinforce Attu by surface ship. American naval and air pressure had made resupply increasingly difficult. There would be no large relief force suddenly appearing offshore. Food was disappearing. Ammunition was limited. Many Japanese soldiers were already wounded. On May the 28th, American forces secured crucial high ground around Chichago Valley, including Fishhook, Buffalo, and Engineer Hills. The next move appeared obvious. The remaining Japanese pocket could be subjected to artillery fire and then eliminated. Yamasaki had begun the battle with roughly 2,600 able-bodied soldiers under his command. By May 28, according to the National Park Service's recent account, only about 800 remained available for combat. There were also around 600 wounded men. This distinction matters because historical descriptions sometimes give roughly 1,000 men for the final attack. The newer NPS account identifies about 800 as still combat capable immediately before it. So, for our story, 800 is not simply a dramatic number inserted into a title. It represents the fighting force Yamasaki had left, and he understood what would happen if he waited. The Americans controlled the heights. Their artillery was available. His perimeter was shrinking. Another day of bombardment could reduce what remained of his command even further. So Yamasaki chose the opposite of waiting. If the American army believed the battle was nearly finished, he would attack at the moment when that belief had begun affecting its posture. The plan was astonishingly ambitious. Break through the weakest part of the American line, reach Engineer Hill, capture American artillery, turn those guns against the Americans, then continue toward Massacre Bay, strike the American supply area, and ultimately withdraw into the mountains. On paper, it bordered on impossible. But Yamasaki no longer had to choose between a safe plan and a dangerous plan. There was no safe plan left. The Japanese had one remaining resource: surprise. This is where the title of this story really begins, because 800 men do not smash through a much larger army simply because they attack aggressively. Something has to go wrong on the other side. And during the early hours of May 29th, something did. Company B of the US 32nd Infantry had been holding part of the forward area. At around 3 a.m., the company received orders to move toward battalion headquarters for a hot breakfast. After more than 2 weeks of cold food, wet clothing, exhausted marches, and continuous combat, this would have seemed completely ordinary. The battle was almost won. Only a small number of sentries remained behind. Then the Japanese came. The attack achieved what Yamasaki desperately needed: surprise. American soldiers in the forward area were caught by an assault coming from an enemy many believed was trapped and nearing destruction. Some troops withdrew toward Fishhook and Buffalo Hills, where they could reorganize. But every yard they gave up opened space, and the Japanese kept moving through it. The terrifying feature of the attack was not simply its violence, it was its direction. They were no longer fighting only against the American infantry facing Chichago Harbor. They were moving into the American rear, and rear areas are different. That is where you find communications personnel, medical facilities, headquarters troops, engineers, supplies, soldiers whose jobs are essential to a battle but who are not normally positioned as the first line of defense against a mass infantry assault. Yamasaki had found the gap. Now, his men had to exploit it before the Americans understood how serious the breakthrough had become. The Japanese pushed out of the Chichago area and through the American positions. Their advance carried them toward the rear installations. One American medical position was directly in their path. The attack overran an advance aid station. Wounded American soldiers were caught inside the breakthrough, and army accounts record that some were killed as the Japanese moved through the medical area. Captain Robert Bassett, an army doctor, attempted to organize medics and wounded men who could still fight. He was killed during the attack. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute, because every position the Japanese passed brought them closer to Engineer Hill. And Engineer Hill mattered for a reason: artillery. If Yamasaki's men could reach those guns, the attack would no longer be merely a penetration by desperate infantry. They would have access to American firepower positioned inside the American defensive system. That possibility had been part of the Japanese plan from the beginning. Think about the battlefield now. Ahead of the Japanese was the artillery. Behind them were American units that had been scattered, bypassed, or forced to reorganize. Around them were rear area American troops suddenly discovering that the front line had moved. Not by miles, by moments. The men at Engineer Hill had very little time to decide what to do. There was no carefully prepared defensive plan designed for hundreds of Japanese troops appearing from this direction. There was no expectation that this position would become the center of the battle, but it was about to. And this is the point where the attack came closest to converting surprise into something much larger. The Japanese had done the part that should have been hardest. They had broken through. Now only an improvised collection of Americans stood between them and the objective Yamasaki believed could transform the battle. Engineer Hill did not suddenly fill with fresh infantry. Instead, Americans who were already there began building a defense from whatever they had. Engineers, medical personnel, headquarters troops, service personnel. Men whose normal responsibilities existed because infantrymen farther forward were supposed to prevent exactly this situation from happening. Now, there was no farther forward. The Japanese were coming toward them. Under Brigadier General Archibald Arnold, the Americans organized a defensive position. Grenades began going downhill. Rifles came into action. The attackers continued upward. The fighting closed to extremely short range. At points, it became hand-to-hand. This was no longer the kind of combat in which commanders could calmly maneuver companies across a map. The Americans were trying to prevent a local collapse from becoming a disaster, and the Japanese were trying to reach the guns before that improvised resistance could harden. That difference, minutes, perhaps even moments, determined what happened next. The Americans held long enough for additional engineers to join the fight. Personnel of the 50th Engineers entered the battle, and now the momentum began to change. The same Japanese attack that had cut through the forward positions was reaching the limit of what surprise could accomplish. The farther the attackers advanced, the more scattered the battlefield became. American defenders were appearing from unexpected directions. The Japanese had no large reserve behind them. They had no second army waiting to exploit success. They had no dependable supply line feeding ammunition into the breakthrough. Everything depended on the men already inside it. And once the defenders on Engineer Hill stopped giving ground, Yamasaki's attack faced a terrible problem. A breakthrough that stops moving becomes a pocket. The 50th Engineers fought the attackers back with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and in some cases, rifle butts. The artillery remained in American hands. That was the moment the strategic possibility inside the Japanese attack began to disappear. The charge had smashed through the line. It had reached deeply enough to threaten the rear. It had brought American support troops into direct combat. But it had not reached the guns. And without those guns, Yamasaki could not turn his breakthrough into the larger plan he had imagined. At this point, there is an obvious question. How could this happen? The United States had landed more than 12,000 men on Attu. Japanese resistance had already been crushed into a tiny area. How could around 800 combat-capable soldiers suddenly penetrate so deeply? The answer was not that the Japanese had somehow become stronger than the Americans. It was the combination of four things. First, timing. The attack came when American commanders believed organized Japanese resistance was almost finished. Second, concentration. The Americans had far more troops across Attu, but Yamasaki concentrated almost everything he could still use against one vulnerable route. Local strength matters more than island-wide strength during the first minutes of a breakthrough. Third, surprise. The departure of Company B toward battalion headquarters for breakfast left only limited protection in the immediate area when the attack began. The Japanese therefore penetrated before a conventional defensive response could form. And fourth, terrain. Attu had already spent 18 days proving how badly mountains, fog, ridges, and narrow valleys could complicate control. The same geography that allowed small Japanese defensive groups to slow American advances now made an unexpected penetration difficult to understand and contain immediately. So the lesson was not that 800 soldiers could defeat an American division. They could not. The lesson was more unsettling. Even a force that is losing everywhere can still be dangerous at one place and one moment if it achieves concentration and surprise. And that is what makes the final attack on Attu different from a simple story about a doomed charge. For a short period, it actually worked. The Japanese found the weak point. They penetrated the line. They reached the rear. They threatened a meaningful objective. They forced men who were never intended to stop a mass assault to become the line themselves. And only then did the attack fail. Once Engineer Hill held, there was nowhere for the Japanese attack to go. American resistance became stronger. Units recovered from the shock. The defenders had prevented Yamasaki from seizing the artillery, and the Japanese force had already committed itself. There was no realistic way to withdraw 800 men back through the same battlefield and rebuild the defensive perimeter they had abandoned. The fighting continued through May 29th. The Japanese could still attack in smaller groups, but they never recreated the power of the original concentrated assault. Colonel Yamasaki himself was killed later that day while leading another effort toward Engineer Hill. By then, the battle had changed character once again. At 3 in the morning, the Americans had been surprised by an enemy they believed was finished. Hours later, the surviving Japanese force was being destroyed. The numbers at the end were extraordinary. The National Park Service records 2,351 Japanese dead over the Battle of Attu and only 28 captured. Another NPS historical study, using slightly different historical totals, describes only 29 survivors from roughly 2,500 defenders. That small difference is exactly why the safest way to describe the outcome is simple. Almost the entire Japanese garrison was destroyed. The American cost was also severe. The recent NPS casualty table lists 549 American dead, 1,148 wounded, around 1,200 severe cold injuries, and another 614 cases of disease, including exposure. So even though the final attack failed, Attu was never a cheap American victory. The island itself had inflicted a terrible price. The battle ended, but its consequences did not. Attu had exposed failures that had nothing to do with Japanese weapons. American soldiers had gone into an Arctic battlefield with equipment that proved inadequate for long exposure to freezing water, wind, snow, and mud. Trench foot and cold injuries became major problems. The experience contributed to changes in army footwear, outdoor equipment, tents, and food. But the strategic consequences were also important. With Attu back under American control, engineers and naval construction units began building and improving airfields. American aircraft later used Attu as a base for operations toward Japan's northern Kuril Islands. On July 10, 1943, 8 B-25 bombers flying from Attu struck Paramushiro in the Kuriles, the first American air attack on Japanese home territory since the Doolittle Raid. And the campaign had another strange final chapter. The Americans expected to fight another bloody battle for Kiska. Instead, the Japanese secretly evacuated the island. When Allied troops landed there in August, the enemy they had prepared to fight was gone. Attu therefore became both a warning and a lesson. A warning about terrain. A warning about weather. A warning about assuming that a defeated enemy has stopped being dangerous. And a lesson about how rapidly the battlefield can change when one side discovers a temporary weakness. The most remarkable part of the final battle on Attu is not that the Japanese attacked despite facing overwhelming defeat. By this stage of the Pacific War, desperate Japanese counterattacks were already becoming part of the pattern American troops would encounter again. What makes Attu different is what happened after the attack began. The 800 combat-capable men remaining under Colonel Yamasaki did not simply run into an intact defensive line and disappear. They found a weakness. They broke through it. American forward positions gave way. The attack penetrated into the rear. A medical position was overrun. The route toward Engineer Hill opened. And, for a short period, the Japanese were moving toward artillery they planned to capture and turn against the Americans themselves. That is why describing the attack only as a suicidal final charge misses part of the story. It was desperate. It was ultimately doomed. But during its opening phase, it was also tactically dangerous. The Americans did not stop it exactly where they expected to fight it. They stopped it where they had to, on Engineer Hill. With engineers, medics, headquarters personnel, and service troops suddenly fighting as infantry because the battlefield had arrived at their position. And that is the real payoff of Attu. Numbers alone did not explain what happened. The Americans had more soldiers, more artillery, more supplies, naval support, air support, and by May 28th, they controlled almost the entire battlefield. But for a few hours on May 29th, none of those advantages automatically protected the weak point Yamasaki had found. 800 men were enough to create a crisis, not enough to win the island, not enough to defeat the American force, but enough to demonstrate one of the oldest rules of war. A battle is not finished simply because one side believes the result is inevitable. On Attu, the Americans were one day away from victory when the defeated enemy suddenly came through their own lines. And the men who finally stopped them were not waiting at the front. They became the front. That is how an 800-man banzai charge smashed through US lines on American soil and still failed just short of the objective that might have made the final hours of Attu even more costly. The Battle of Attu ended on May 30th, 1943. Today, it remains one of the least remembered major ground battles fought by the United States in World War II. But for the Americans standing on Engineer Hill before dawn, it was impossible to forget. Because for a few terrifying hours, the enemy they thought they had already beaten was suddenly behind them.